Alfonso Cahero, A Journey into Finance History. Chapter 69, Increasing Focus on Sustainable and ESG Investing, Early 21st Century. Investors prioritize environmental, social, and governance factors. In the bustling streets of the early 21st century, amidst the chaos of financial markets and corporate giants, a subtle yet powerful shift was taking place. Investors, once solely driven by profit margins and bottom lines, began to cast their gaze towards something more profound: sustainability. It was an awakening, a realization that the pursuit of wealth should not come at the expense of our planet or its people. Among these visionary investors was Sarah, a young financial analyst with a passion for making a difference. As she pored over endless spreadsheets and market reports, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. It wasn't until she stumbled upon a research paper discussing the concept of environmental, social, and governance, ESG investing, that everything clicked into place. Sarah found herself captivated by the idea that investing could be about more than just making money. It could also be a force for good in the world. She began to delve deeper into the principles of ESG investing, immersing herself in studies and discussions about how companies' environmental impact, social responsibility, and governance practices could influence their long-term performance. With each passing day, Sarah's conviction grew stronger. She knew that she had stumbled upon something revolutionary, something that could change the way people thought about investing forever. And so, armed with newfound knowledge and a fierce determination, she set out to spread the word about the power of ESG investing. Sarah was not alone in her quest to promote sustainable investing. Across the globe, like-minded individuals were coming together to form a movement that would prioritize the well-being of our planet and its inhabitants above all else. From boardrooms to university campuses, conversations about ESG investing were becoming increasingly common. People from all walks of life were starting to question the traditional wisdom that maximizing profits at any cost was the only goal of investing. For Sarah, this sense of solidarity was both empowering and invigorating. She found herself surrounded by a community of passionate individuals who shared her vision for a more sustainable future. Together, they began to strategize about how best to spread the message of ESG investing far and wide. They organized workshops and seminars, wrote articles and blog posts, and engaged in countless discussions with anyone who would listen. Slowly but surely, their efforts began to bear fruit as more and more people became aware of the potential of ESG investing to create positive change in the world. As the demand for sustainable investments grew, so too did the number of companies striving to meet this newfound demand. From renewable energy startups to fair trade coffee producers, businesses began to see the value in incorporating ESG principles into their operations. For Sarah and her fellow advocates, this was a thrilling development. No longer were they limited to choosing between financial success and social responsibility. Instead, they found themselves presented with a wealth of investment opportunities that aligned with their values. They pored over prospectuses and financial statements, evaluating companies not only on their profit potential, but also on their commitment to sustainability. And as they did, they began to notice a curious trend. Companies that prioritized ESG factors tended to outperform their peers in the long run. This realization only served to fuel their passion for ESG investing further. They became tireless champions for sustainable companies, using their influence to encourage others to invest in businesses that were not only profitable, but also making a positive impact on the world. Of course, the road to widespread adoption of ESG investing was not without its challenges. Skeptics argued that prioritizing sustainability would come at the expense of financial returns, while others questioned the reliability of ESG metrics. Undeterred, Sarah and her fellow advocates pressed on, working tirelessly to dispel these myths and prove that ESG investing could indeed deliver competitive returns. They collaborated with researchers and data analysts to develop robust methodologies for assessing ESG performance, laying the groundwork for a more transparent and accountable investment landscape. They also worked to address concerns about greenwashing, the practice of companies exaggerating or misrepresenting their environmental credentials to attract investors. By advocating for standardized reporting frameworks and greater transparency, they sought to ensure that investors could make informed decisions about where to put their money. Despite these challenges, Sarah remained steadfast in her belief that ESG investing was the way of the future. She knew that change wouldn't happen overnight, but she was confident that with perseverance and determination, they would eventually overcome the obstacles standing in their way. As awareness of ESG investing continued to spread, it reached a critical mass, a tipping point beyond which there was no turning back. Institutional investors, from pension funds to sovereign wealth funds, began to integrate ESG criteria into their investment decisions, signaling a seismic shift in the financial industry. For Sarah, this was a moment of triumph. What had started as a fringe movement was now being embraced by some of the largest and most influential investors in the world. It was a validation of everything she had worked so hard to achieve, a sign that the tide was finally turning in favor of sustainability. But even as she celebrated this milestone, Sarah knew that there was still much work to be done. While institutional investors were beginning to embrace ESG investing, individual investors lagged behind, largely unaware of the opportunities it presented. So she redoubled her efforts, reaching out to retail investors through social media, workshops, and educational campaigns. She shared success stories of companies that had embraced ESG principles and seen their stock prices soar, hoping to inspire others to follow suit. And slowly but surely, her efforts began to pay off. Retail investors started to take notice, realizing that they too could play a role in driving positive change through their investment decisions. It was a turning point, not just for the financial industry, but for society as a whole. As ESG investing continued to gain traction, it began to move from the fringes of the financial world to the mainstream. Major financial institutions started to launch ESG-focused funds, giving investors of all stripes easy access to sustainable investment opportunities. For Sarah, this was a welcome development. No longer did she have to spend hours poring over individual companies' ESG scores. Now, she could simply invest in a diversified ESG fund and let the professionals handle the rest. But even as ESG investing became more accessible, Sarah remained vigilant. She knew that with greater visibility came the risk of dilution, of ESG becoming little more than a buzzword, stripped of its meaning and purpose. So she continued to advocate for robust ESG standards and rigorous oversight, urging regulators to crack down on greenwashing and ensure that companies lived up to their sustainability promises. It was a never-ending battle, but one that Sarah was determined to fight with every ounce of her being. As ESG investing gained momentum, investors began to realize that they had a powerful tool at their disposal: shareholder engagement. By using their influence as shareholders, they could push companies to adopt more sustainable practices, from reducing their carbon footprint to improving labor conditions in their supply chains. Sarah was at the forefront of this movement, attending shareholder meetings and submitting resolutions on behalf of herself and other concerned investors. She knew that real change wouldn't happen overnight, but she also knew that by working together, they could make a difference. And make a difference they did. Companies that once dismissed sustainability concerns as secondary to profit now found themselves facing pressure from shareholders demanding change. Sarah and her fellow advocates leveraged their positions to engage with corporate leadership, presenting data and making compelling arguments for why sustainable practices were not only morally imperative, but financially prudent as well. Their efforts began to yield results. Some companies appointed sustainability officers, while others committed to reducing their carbon emissions or increasing diversity in their workforce. These were small victories, but they signaled a larger shift in corporate consciousness, a recognition that the interests of shareholders were increasingly aligned with the interests of society at large. As ESG investing continued to gain momentum, it began to reshape the very foundations of capitalism itself. Investors no longer viewed profit as the sole measure of success. Instead, they looked at a company's broader impact on the world, its contributions to environmental preservation, social justice, and good governance. This new paradigm forced companies to rethink their priorities. No longer could they ignore the externalities of their operations, or exploit vulnerable communities with impunity. Instead, they were held accountable not just to their shareholders, but to society as a whole.